I'm Tom Mitzi, Theater Director for the Thousand Oaks Civic Arts Plaza, and my guest today is Ambassador Robert Nesen. And we're talking about the city of Thousand Oaks, its history, its present, and its future. Ambassador Nesen, could you tell us what brought you to Thousand Oaks?
Well, I've been traveling. I've lived in Ventura County for 55 years, except what time I was out of the country for when I was ambassador to Australia, and also when I was assistant secretary of Navy for Nixon. And I decided after being here a few years that I didn't want to live anywhere else except Ventura County. And I think I made the right decision because I always enjoyed living here. And I started out, I came up here right after the war. And I remember at that time, Thousand Oaks was, as I recall, about 1,500 people. It was just a little village. And, but I lived in Oxnard because the airport was there, and that was before they had built Camarillo Airport. And I started a flight school there, a GI flight school, which after the war, during the war, everybody was saying there was going to be 2 airplanes in every garage and no automobiles. But after a short while, I could see that that wasn't going to happen. And so, and I knew the GI flight school wouldn't last forever because it was a government-sponsored thing. But we had at one time, we had a lot of students that were GI, a lot of them from the Navy base at Hueneme and Point Mugu. But I stayed with that 2 years, and there wasn't hardly any automobile dealerships in Ventura or in Oxnard, so I went in the automobile business. Well, and then I lived in Camarillo for 20-some years. And Cadillac and Olds decided that they were going to have to build a dealership up here when they decided there was no dealerships here at the time. It was just pasture land out there where the auto mall is now. And in fact, after they put the freeway in, of course the freeway wasn't here when I first came to Thousand Oaks, or to the county. And the freeway went right by this, kind of cut this property in two where the auto mall is now. And I often thought that that would be a great place for an automobile dealership. Well, I was about the second or third one to come in here, right in the beginning of it. I bought the land from American Hawaiian Steamship Company, or I guess it was Steamship Company. But I thought maybe it was a little too early to come in here because the town wasn't too big then. That was before Westlake was there. In fact, Joe Russell, one of the pioneers here, lived over in what is now part of Westlake, or the west part of it. And by the way, he was he called himself Mr. Republican. In fact, he was a Republican, no question about it. So I decided I wanted to move up here, move my dealership up here. And that was about 30 years ago. I'd been in the county about 25 years then. And as I said, I sure didn't make a mistake by coming to Ventura County and this area. I can remember when Joe Russell owned part of that land, and the rest of it was an automobile dealer from Los Angeles. Can't think of his name now. And he didn't live here, he just come out on weekends. But Joe Russell ran cattle what is now Westlake. And he also owned some of the land, I think, north of what is now the freeway. He was Mr. kind of Ventura County, Joe was. He was a good guy. Of course, I got to say that because he's a Republican. And the Jans, I remember when the Jans lived here, and Ed Jans had a runway along where the freeway is now, because he lived over by where the golf course is there now, Los Robles. And in fact, I sold him when I was still at the in the flying business. I sold him a new Navion, which was made then by North American. I'll never forget about Ed. He knew how to fly, but he wanted me to check him out in this Navion, so I did. And he flew it very well. But next day I heard that he'd come in and landed and forgot to put the gear down. So the Navion kind of got schmiggled up a little bit, but he got it all fixed up and going again. The Jans did a lot, I gotta say that, to develop this area, because they owned a lot in here, a lot of land. I can remember where the big shopping center, the big mall now, that used to be a barns in there where the Jans kept their horses. They had Ed had race horses, and that was all his kind of the Jan stables in there. But then they finally, after the freeway came in, well, it kind of got separated, and he sold it off, and they built the mall there. I can remember coming through here, and it was just a two-lane street, what is now Thousand Oaks Boulevard. And the street was divided, just one little spot there, because there was a huge oak tree in the middle of the street. And it got hit quite a few times. But Thousand Oaks was a very small town at that time, and of course I can remember when it incorporated. The City Hall was down on Thousand Oaks Boulevard, just when it first started. Trying to think who the first mayor. I can't remember who was the first mayor. I knew a man that was quite well known around here and died a short while ago. Was John Conlon. He was a county supervisor and a good friend of mine. I miss him. We used to have lunch together every Friday noon. And I really miss John. But as I say, the city has grown well. I think that Westlake helped it. It certainly didn't hurt it, and I don't think it does to this day. I noticed where the two chambers of commerce now are joined into one, and that's good because they both work together, and I think it's working out fine. Have you got anything you want to ask me?
No, just sitting here listening to you talk. What of the changes that you've seen over the years, which are the ones that are the most dramatic, or do you think have had the most impact on the people of Thousand Oaks?
Well, I think the City Hall is one thing that's changed it. It used to be over on Thousand Oaks Boulevard, and then it moved out on the hill, then it moved down below there, and then it moved here. Here. No, it was across the road.
It was across the road, yes.
Right, and then it moved here. So it's been quite a change from the first. I think they rented a place, a little building on Thousand Oaks Boulevard to start out with. I don't remember who the first mayor was, but I think it's developed, and the planning department and all should be complimented, because I don't know of a nicer city in the United States as this is, and Westlake too. When I first moved up here 30 years ago, I lived in Westlake over in the South Hills. But I think the lake and all has been a great addition to it. Has helped Thousand Oaks, and Thousand Oaks, of course, has helped it. So, and I don't think there's any problems between the two, even though it is in another county. But I give a lot of credit to the people that have been running the city. I think they've done a good job trying to control overgrowth of any particular. I think we've got nice big homes, we've got small homes, we've got everything here that makes a complete area, and I think it's well run. Maybe you could ask me some more questions.
You were, before, you were telling me a story about a movie being shot that sounded kind of fun.
Oh, and that was supposed to be a circus out there, and Elvis Presley was in the movie. And I live out in Hidden Valley on Trail Road, and I remember that where the road turns directly north, a 90-degree turn, and Barbara Stanwyck was the mother of a girl riding in the back of this Jeep, and Elvis Presley was following along with it in his motorcycle. And I think he paid too much attention to the girl. Well, anyway, he ran off the road to the left and went through the fence, the fence along the road of my property. So I had to, or they repaired the fence, it was no problem. I often remember about him. Another thing on my property out there, there's a horse buried, and I don't know where. I tried to find out. The people that owned it had owned it since 1920, when I bought it in '78. But this horse, Teddy Roosevelt, rode in when he was inaugurated back in Washington. Now, if I can talk a little bit about politics.
Absolutely.
I was in the reserve, the Navy Reserve at Los Alamitos flying, and one of the fellows in my squadron was named Ryan, Tom Ryan. Well, his sister was Pat Ryan, who was married to Dick Nixon. And he asked me one weekend, we were down there, he says, next month I'm going to bring my brother-in-law and sister down for dinner. Would you like to have dinner with us? And I said, yeah, that'd be fine. So that's when I met Dick Nixon and his wife, Pat. And I said something to him that I says, if you ever run for a statewide office, he was a congressman from Whittier at the time. Right? He was in the Navy during the war too. And so I said, if you ever run for statewide office, I kind of a little political background in Ventura County, and I'd be glad to help you up there. Well, about 3 months later, he called me, and he said, I'm going to take you up on your deal. I said, what do you mean? He says, I'm going to run for the Senate. So I said, I'd be glad to help you. So that started me in politics, and at that time, Ventura County was heavily Democratic, but we won some, we lost some. And then so I worked for Nixon then in every campaign he was in. As I say, we lost the '60 election, we won it in '68, and I traveled with him, and he became a very good friend. In fact, I got a letter from him about, I think it was the only handwritten letter I ever got from a president, shortly before he died. And I felt that morning when I read the letter that he was trying to tell me goodbye, maybe. But that's one of the great things that I've got, is that personal letter from him. Then and I worked in when he would come out here, I always loaned him a Cadillac to drive. And then in 1960, they wanted to, or they had somehow connected with Reagan, and he was a Democrat then. And so I had to go down and pick him up at his home. Then I worked for him in every campaign he had. And he was the one, Nixon had me come back to Washington. I was Assistant Secretary of Navy then. And then Reagan called me. I was back in Washington at the inauguration. And that afternoon, about 5 o'clock, he called me because he wanted me to be Secretary of Navy. Well, I'd been there, done the other, and with John Warner, and who's now a senator. But I didn't care what I did. Whatever he wanted me to do, I would do it. Well, anyway, about 5 o'clock that afternoon, this was inauguration. I don't know if he just moved into the White House, I guess, that day. And so he called me and said that the thing with the Navy, there was a political thing going on. Would I like to be an ambassador? Well, I'd never even thought about being an ambassador. And I said, well, I'll do whatever you want me to do. And he said, I'll give you 5 options. Well, for me, I never asked to be an ambassador. And by the way, I want to say that it didn't cost me $500,000. I never give any money. I gave of myself and worked for the campaigns, but I never gave much money to it. And to be offered 5 different ambassadorships kind of stunned me. But 4 of them were in Europe, and the other was Australia, and he kept talking about Australia. So I said, well, gee, can I think about it, and I'll come over in the morning and make up my mind. And so the next morning, I went over there, and Mike Deaver come out to pick me up, and he said, take Australia. Mike had been in Australia at the time, and I'd never been there. So then as I went in the White House, Ed Meese was out in the hallway, and he said, take Australia. So I figured, I guess they want me to go to Australia. And because the president brought it up 2 or 3 times during our conversation, that brought up Australia and what a nice country. Well, I couldn't have gotten a better position. I think Australia is great, and our relationship politically, at the time there was a liberal prime minister, Fraser, and the Liberal Party is about the same as the Republican Party here in this country. And then there's the Labor Party over there. Well, in the middle of the time, I was down there for 5 years. I was there longer than any ambassador. Kind of getting off in Thousand Oaks, but I'll get back to it if there's anything. And anyway, Bob Hawke got elected as prime minister. He was in the government down there, and he was sworn in out at Government House at noon, and at 1 o'clock he called me and asked if I'd come over to Parliament House and see him. You want to talk to me? So I said, well, yeah, I'll come over. And when he hadn't even moved into his office yet. There was stuff piling all around. He asked my assistant and his assistant to leave the room. He wanted to talk to me. So first thing he says, now, your name's Bob, my name's Bob, so from now on we say Bob and Bob. We don't go through all this formalities. I said, well, he was as good a prime minister as I could ever work for. We had a great relationship, and the day before Delta and I left down there, he had us over to lunch at his home. And so he said, "Now I want to talk to you a minute." We went in the library after we finished lunch, the four of us, the two wives. And he says, "You know, in my campaign, I said I wasn't going to travel like Fraser's been traveling all over the world." But he says, "How soon do you think you can get me an appointment with President Reagan?" I said, "Well, I don't know. I'll call and find out." So I called and talked to Mike Deaver, and I says, "Can you find out how quick we could set up an appointment or a visit?" And Mike said, "Come back the next day," and he says, "Well, about 2 weeks from such and such." Well, that's pretty quick to set up an appointment between the Prime Minister and a visit. But I think that President Reagan pretty well liked Bob Hawke, even though he was a Labor Party, which is like the Democrat Party here in the United States practically. But sure enough, we set it up, and 2 weeks later we were over here with a visit between the Prime Minister and the President. Now, to get back to Thousand Oaks, why don't you ask me some questions?
Have you been involved with the Reagan Library here?
Oh yeah, I go up there a lot. I was there about 2 months ago. That was in, I think it was December, because they told me that the president was coming out there if he felt good enough that day. His having Alzheimer's kind of hits me pretty hard. My wife has it, and she lives over at Mary Health in Newberry Park. And I want to say, I just can't say enough good about it. It's run by Catholic nuns, but they just do a wonderful job over there. And it makes it easier for me because she's there. I don't know of a nicer place. Well, so we went up there. They called me and said he's going to be here for sure in about 2 hours, because they were getting ready to leave down in Los Angeles. So the district attorney, Mike Bradbury, who was a good friend of mine, and he'd never met Nixon, and he'd been to a couple of Republican conventions with me, and so I says, "Well, I'll meet you there such and such a time." Well, he came, and he had his nurse with him, and I really would just soon be the last time that I saw him, because he smiled, and I don't know if he knew me or not. I'm used to this with my wife, but he was Ronald Reagan, except he couldn't answer any questions. I knew not to ask him questions, because that's what's tough, is they can't answer. So you don't ask him questions, you just talk to him. And he looked great, and if I don't see him again, I'll remember him that way, he was a wonderful guy.
Well, you've been so involved with the past of Thousand Oaks. What kind of dreams would you have for the future of Thousand Oaks?
Well, if they just keep going the way they are, there's only so far they can go unless they annex more land or something. And I think that the way they've been running it and built it and developed it is just fine. Keep going that way.
Do you have a personal model or code that you live by, or that you could recommend to people?
No, but I will say this. I was born in Michigan, and when I was 18 years old, I came to California. And then I went through school down at Curtis Wright, and then I went in the service, World War II, and I came here. And as I said, I'd never leave here. I think it's the greatest place and the greatest climate you could ask for anywhere. And about my life, if I had to live over, I'd like to do just what I've done. And I think if you feel that way, that's pretty good. Because I've been very fortunate to know 2 presidents and to live in a great place like Ventura County and Thousand Oaks.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate your coming in today.
All right. Thank you.